Yeah. Oh, it's not live stream, it's just recording. Right. Presentation by Ms. King.
We're just recording.
Oh, we're not doing it.
So we'll upload this later.
So in terms of the
Presentation.
committee presentation, is that being shown to members?
That's just during the chairman. Can we have, I'm afraid to apologise for this, can we have a short adjournment of 5 minutes? While the technical matter of the presentation is sorted out.
This has raised no objection from the land drainage consultants. Concerns have been raised by local residents with regards to the potential for increased surface water runoff from the site onto the road to the north, which could have impact on properties to the north as they are located downhill. However, detailed discussions have taken place with land drainage consultants and submission of drainage strategy subject to conditions. They are satisfied that the infiltration basin will prevent any surface water from any runoff leaving the site. Next slide, please. This photo into the site from the roadside and the access gateway. The bottom was also a photo of the wider field towards the east beyond the site. Queries were raised on the visit regarding the impact of achieving visibility displays. To do so, 1 metre of hedgerow is to be removed from either side of the existing access. However, an additional 3 metres of hedgerow is introduced as it extends into the site. Further to this, 324 metres of hedgerow, vegetation and trees are proposed across the site as a whole. Next slide, please. Here we have a photo looking west across the site and another photo looking to the rear of the site with the woodland boundary. Next slide, please. The top photo is looking south across the site to the boundary hedgerow adjacent to the road. The bottom photo looking back towards the access and the northeast of the site. The dwelling that can be seen is of the applicants, Old Kilns. This is the only property that overlooks the field directly. As noted on the site yesterday and visible in the image, the tump that was created from land to the west of the site and the kilns themselves underneath this will be unaffected by the development, with contaminated land condition to include it to secure investigative works with regards to the previous quarry. To conclude, the site is considered to be directly adjacent to the main built-up form of Howell Hill and indeed is adjacent to the proposed settlement boundary set out in Regulation 16 draft NDP. The proposal at this stage is in outline form with all matters reserved, and it's considered that with sensitive siting, design and landscaping, which would be agreed at reserved matters stage, the 3 dwellings would fit comfortably within the landscape. There have been no technical objection raised to the scheme. The proposal is in accordance with the NPPF and core strategy policies and is therefore recommended for approval, subject to the recommended conditions.
Thank you. I now invite Mrs. Akers of Walford Parish Council to speak. You have 3 minutes.
The Walford NDP establishes several settlement boundaries within Walford Parish. 3 of those settlement boundaries are located on Howell Hill. The site of this application sits in an open field outside of any of these 3 Howell Hill settlement boundaries. The Walford NDP is currently at Regulation 16 stage, which ends on 31st of August. It is noted that material consideration has been given to Regulation 14 stage of our NDP in determining other recent local planning applications, including the pavilion in the field next to the nursery. I ask that the committee take notice that this application is outside of our proposed settlement boundaries. The application first came before Walford Parish Council at its meeting on 17th of February 21, 5 dwellings, and again at the meeting on 21st of July 21, 3 dwellings. The application was carefully considered by the council at each of these meetings, and in both cases, Walford Parish Council voted to object to the application. There was strong local opposition on both occasions from residents. The reasons for these objections have been submitted to Herefordshire Council and are available on the website. I'd like to restate those reasons again. Howell Hill is a hamlet comprising several small clusters of dwellings separated by open fields, collectively defined as the forest small holdings landscape type. This proposed development would represent a density and visual appearance that would be completely out of keeping with the area. The services and amenities that originally qualified Howell Hill as a settlement, for example, the pub and the church, no longer exist. Therefore, this site would not be a sustainable development, which is contrary to core strategy policies SS1 and RA2. The proposed site is not in a sustainable location, with access to Howell Hill via very steep, unlit, narrow and winding country lanes. Church Lane itself, located off Howell Hill Road, is a very narrow, dead-end, single-track lane with no pavements or verges and struggles to cope with the current levels of traffic, including horse riders, cyclists and walkers. There is no public transport provision on Howell Hill, meaning the development is not sustainable, which is contrary to policies SS1 and RA2. The siting and urban style of the houses being proposed is not in keeping with the existing character of the hamlet, which is contrary to core strategy policy RA2. There would be significant increase in light pollution arising from these dwellings. I would like to restate that this application has been carefully considered twice by Walford Parish Council, and the council voted to object to the application on both occasions. Herefordshire Council has shown it has sufficient housing land available for just over 6 years, so this development is not needed.
Thank you. Just in time. Thank you. And now I invite Mr. Kendrick to speak on behalf of the local residents.
Thank you very much for enabling me to speak to the committee. I act on behalf of a substantial group of local objectors to the proposal, and I emphasise local. The planning officer's report asks more questions than it answers. There's clearly been a slanting and changing within the report to support the applicant rather than a traditional independence, and to its conclusions, particularly with regard to vital elements of conditions, which I'll come to at the end of my brief submission. This is land in the open countryside. This committee have spent 4 decades, to my personal knowledge, resisting applications in the open countryside. That's what it is. There is selective avoidance and an ambiguous description of the pre-application advice that the applicant has received. What has the applicant been told? Has the applicant been encouraged to submit an application in open countryside? If we look at the application again, there's no true indication of mass or scale in what appears to be an attempt to secure a form of residential consent at any cost by any manoeuvre. 3 dwellings to 5 dwellings to 5 dwellings to 3, change in position, change in location, change in size. There's clear evidence that the road network adjoining the site cannot cope with the proposal. Many members, I'm sure, discovered that on the site visit. The longevity and tenacity of opposition to the proposal has led basically to the creation of the neighbourhood plan. You as a committee and as a council are encouraging local authorities to identify sites that should be developed for residential and other purposes within their neighbourhood plan. The council is acting entirely in accordance with your advice. This is the wrong type of application on the wrong site in the wrong application. There's no need for further housing to be provided in completely isolated and unsustainable locations on the basis the council has well exceeded its housing land requirements. The committee, I'm asking, should continue to facilitate housing development in accordance with National Planning Policy Framework, which of course is sustainable development. This development is not sustainable, and in accordance with their emerging local plan, again on sustainability, and they should give considerable weight to the voice of the local community and their emerging neighbourhood plan. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kendrick. You were about 10 seconds over discussion. Thank you. If you can now take your seats back in the main room. Right, now we come to the ward member. Councillor William Wilding is acting as a proxy for the ward member, Councillor Yolandi Watson, for this item. He speaks first and then has the right to speak at the end of the debate. He does not have a vote. 10 minutes time.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you to all the members who came to the site visit yesterday. I don't intend to repeat a lot of what I said yesterday, although I will just run through the main points. The site is not sustainable. There's no bus service, no pub, no shops, no village hall. The roads are small with no passing places. Construction traffic would be a nightmare. There are too many vehicles using the roads already. There are no passing places or turning circles. The parish council had to put an unsuitable for HGV signs because of damage to residents' property. And the members who were there will remember me pointing out there was a crack in one of the residents' walls where an HGV had reversed into it trying to turn round. Howell Hill is not a village. It's just a scattering of houses. It has already surpassed the 14% growth target. Herefordshire, as pointed out, has achieved a 6-year housing land supply. The NPPF seeks to restrict development in isolated locations. Will this application open the door to more applications? The area is rich in wildlife, which will be displaced. The woodland above the site has a lot of wildlife in it, and that wildlife will be disturbed by this development. The water runoff from the site and surrounding hill is already a major problem for residents further down the hill, and building more houses will only exacerbate that problem. Runoff from the fields goes into the roads and into residents' properties. The mitigating measures are for the new builds and won't affect existing residents, won't help them rather. The council's drainage officer acknowledges that water comes from the top of the hill, and a map shows there is a spring above the site. The field presently acts as a natural flood defence and slows that water down. You saw from the massive turnout of protesters that there are problems and they're real and considered of the utmost importance by the local residents. How often do you see that level of protest at a site visit? Our present core strategy says we should balance environmental issues with economic and social needs to ensure that development is sustainable and does not cause irreversible harm. It says we must meet the challenge of climate change. Policy SS1 asks for a presumption in favour of sustainable development. That's fine, but this is not sustainable because the impacts of granting permission would significantly outweigh the benefits. Our core strategy objectives, including providing affordable housing, that's not what's going to be built here. We are asked to ensure new developments positively contribute towards better access to education and health facilities. That will not be possible here. It says we should aim to reduce the need for travel and lessen the harmful impacts from increased traffic. This development will not do that. Policy SS4, new development should be located to minimise impacts on the transport network. Policy SS6, development should conserve and enhance those environmental assets that contribute towards the county's distinctiveness. Around this area, that means beautiful open countryside bordering, very closely bordering the AONB. And also it means species-rich hedgerows, one of which will be ruined to create a view for drivers. The officer's report says 1 metre will need to be removed. I think anyone standing at that entrance will tell you the road is very small, the hedge is right up to the road. How can it only need 1 metre removed to make a splay? It's going to need a lot more than that.
Proposals should maintain and improve the effectiveness of the ecosystems essential to the health and well-being of the county's residents. Well, climate change will seriously affect our residents. They will suffer floods, droughts, heat waves, which can kill vulnerable people, and all manner of problems unknown at present, caused by mass extinctions, mass migrations in the years to come. The local plan says tackling climate change in Herefordshire will be a difficult challenge. Well, that's true if councillors who voted to declare a climate emergency don't take decisions that address that challenge. That's definitely true if our planning department sticks to an outdated interpretation of what is sustainable. Policy SS7 seeks to reduce the need to travel by private car and encourages sustainable travel options. Can't be done here. Policy RA1 says that development should be proportionate to the size of the community. This community is 55 scattered houses already, and it already has a large addition planned at the former Howell Hill Nursery. So any more is not proportionate. Finally, the NDP. While it's not passed, it's at a very advanced stage, and the parish council have put a lot of thought and experience into it. This site is outside of the NDP area, and it, as you've heard, is not supported by the parish council. Why has the planning department not given the NDP more weight? Because to ask local people to put so much time and energy into making an NDP and then to take no notice of it, not to give it enough weight, is to my mind wrong. So to sum up, there's two big elephants in this room. The site is unsustainable. Building on it will only add to our climate change and biodiversity problems. The roads are too small and the introduction of further traffic is unacceptable. The site is a sponge that already helps mitigate the local water runoff. The field is a buffer between people and nature. So building on it will disturb natural habitats, and it will also condemn residents further down the hill to more flooding misery. What's proposed, while we accept there is a climate and ecological emergency, is that we vote to make it worse. This is an outline planning application, and as such, the planning committee are being asked a simple question: is this site a good place to build? Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Right. We now move to the debate. I'm looking for speakers. Councillor Norman.
Thank you, Chair. Start by saying how useful I think the site visit was. They're not always, you feel, well, why bother? But in this case, I think being there really did bring home to me how very unsuitable this spot is. Very narrow roads, as we've heard, incredibly narrow roads, and a site that has a huge amount of value ecologically and environmentally. I think the Councillor Wilding has made some very valid points, and I agree with pretty well all of them, in fact, so I won't repeat them in detail, but just to focus on the fact that just being there, we all were aware of the narrowness of the road. A surprising number of cars using that road, because of course there is no alternative at all. And this sort of development will add to that and the problems that it generates. We were made aware of the problems of flooding, the fact that this is on a slope and that there is a regular issue with flooding, and that is very difficult, as things are, to deal with. But in fact, adding infrastructure, as we've heard, to build homes on land which is at least in part absorbing some of that water is going to make it a great deal worse, I would have thought. That seems pretty clear to me. The fact that there's no services whatsoever in this area also makes it completely unsustainable. And I really don't know why we're even looking at this, given all the issues that we've been considering and debating and discussing for a number of years now. It seems to me really quite extraordinary that it's even on our agenda. I just also wanted to draw attention to the point made, point 4.5, and ecology. And it's always unclear quite whether there's an objection or whether it's been superseded by comments, but there is a clear comment here that at this time, due to legal and scientific uncertainty and phosphate neutrality not secured, there is an identified adverse effect on the integrity of the River Wye, special area conservation. Now, I don't know where we are, but I feel it's important we ask that question virtually with any application which comes to us. Can we be assured that that we are not adding to a problem that we're already very aware of? And as I asked in the previous application, can we be absolutely assured that there'd be no addition to the nutrient impact, in this case, on the Lug? And I'm not sure we can be, but I'll put that out there as a question. But I just finally come back to the point. Oh, final point, sorry, that I'd like to make is about the NDP. As has been said, we expect volunteers to put huge amounts of time and effort into developing these plans, and then all too often we're not prepared to note points that are made in them. Strongly opposed by the parish council and most residents, we gather. The 14% growth has already been achieved, so it's not actually necessary. There are many points. I think I've probably emphasised them.
3 minutes.
Thank you very much. I think I've made the main ones I wanted to make. Thank you.
Councillor Andrews.
Thank you, Chairman. I must agree with Councillor Norman, the value of the site visit here. Many of the points have already been raised, but as I say, it is totally unsustainable. But one comment I would make on the return journey, expertly driven as I was by Councillor Rowan, we noted that the pedestrians had to leap into the hedges for the car to get past. So absolutely no room otherwise. But I would point out, I understand in 4.9, this is a former quarry. What's underneath the rather nice grassed surface, I ask? Because in my experience, quarries that have been filled in tend to be repositories of all sorts of peculiar substances. So how safe is it even to dig this up? Surely this is open countryside. It must be. Really, I find it absolutely amazing that this application is even in front of us.
Councillor Davis, now Councillor.
I would just like to share my experience yesterday. I found, as the other councillors have mentioned, very important to visit sites. My experience was I had to reverse along that very narrow road, and there were some people with their little dogs, and they, I didn't know where I was going to be reversing to, and they were trying to go into the hedge. I just thought, if lorries are coming down this road as well, I just felt it was totally unsustainable. My comments.
Thank you. Councillor Mill.
Have we done our site visit, not yesterday, but 150 or plus years ago?
I'm sure you were there, Councillor Mill.
In some respects, intellectually, I'm very often 150 years behind everybody else. But we would have seen a busy landscape. This, as Councillor Andrews observed, is a quarry site. And indeed, the case officer referenced in her presentation a lime kiln to the west, a clam kiln, and indeed the site name gives it away as old kilns. It's an LD4 comment, really, and I'm sorry that we don't appear to have considered LD4 or policy LD4 for the historic landscape in view of the fact that this is a site recorded on Heritage Council's historic landscape. Historic environment record, that's number 40272, so it's a material consideration in planning. And roughly half the site is under a quarry, about nearly half the site up to the west was quarried, and to the east, no, I got that the wrong way around, to the east was not quarried, to the west. To the east was quarry to the west wasn't. I think that's the right way around. In the 19th century, the quarry site had a little railway through it, believe it or not, according to the early map evidence. It was probably a primitive flanged plate tramway taking stone from the quarry place to lime kilns, and an intriguing place with very good walkable neighbourhood connections to a church and a pub and a meeting room and a Sunday school and a whole host of facilities, all of which we've lost. So 150 years ago, this little community, you could genuinely say, was a self-sustaining place. Alas, it is no more. And so my little essay into the historic landscape, educational though it is, doesn't alas give us any support for this application, because clearly, as other members have observed, we are where we are, and this application cannot be supported without a very car-dependent approach to development. And as the board member Foxy has observed, that conflicts with our climate change policy undertaking. So I'm afraid I'm not able to support this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Captain. I think we need perhaps we should have been grateful if you'd have been around in 150 years. The quarry mightn't have got planning permission anyway. All right. Any other speakers? There are none.
Go on then.
We have Councillor Rowe.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I've said it before at planning, maybe starting there. How far have they got to walk to find a pub, buy a pint of milk, get a packet of smokes, a newspaper? And you also got to take into consideration when you walk on that particular site, what sort of gradient are you going to deal with? So let's step it up. How far would I have to cycle to get all those aforementioned? How far would I have to cycle with a 5-year-old to get education, an 11-year-old to get slightly higher education? Now, if you add all that together, the fact that it is outline planning, so therefore we don't have any real concept of what is going to be the next stage and what's going to come forward. And I take an awful lot of notice of what the proxy ward member has said about sustainability and the decision we made in March 2019 and subsequently about the challenges that this county and the whole world face. So with regard to the very good officer report and all that was contained within, it all boils down to, is this a sustainable site? For me, it's not. It really, really isn't. Even the walking and cycling man trip, it's not sustainable. Highways report, however, does point out that it is. You know, it's how Herefordians get about in their little 4-wheel independent vehicle. So I'm really struggling here to nod this one through, and listening to my extremely experienced, and there's a lot of experience sat in this committee. I'm struggling to see that we could go with this. Is it an open countryside, Councillor Andrews? Well, there's 1 or 2 sparsely placed houses there which are very old, but I think I'm going to have to go with the great minds that sit on this committee and go against officer recommendation on this one.
Thank you, Councillor. Now, bearing in mind, I'm sorry I arrived rather late at a particular meeting, but I have to say, and I realise that we have some difficulty here with the planning policy matters. If members, as it appears to be, are minded to refuse this, we have to be careful and think this through very carefully. So I have to say, from my point of view, I don't recall ever going to a site where the road infrastructure was as bad as this particular site. I've been thinking back, and I cannot remember one quite like this. I'm sure that we've had some bad ones ever, but anyway, perhaps I will ask our officers about, they can give some guidance as far as the planning policy issues are concerned, mindful of the fact that we have to form the planning policy. Councillor Norman.
Just that I did ask a question, and I wondered perhaps if Mr. Bishop is going to speak, he could incorporate some sort of response to that. That was about this point about the adverse effect on the Y, essentially.
I'll answer that straight away, Chairman. I would hope you would have confidence in your officers when they put the papers before you. The ecologist at the end of the comment clearly identifies no objections, and that is the comment from the ecologist. And it's not on the River Lug; it's the River Wye.
It's the Y, absolutely. No, I did see the
You
Y.
mentioned the Lug.
Oh, sorry, probably.
So it was only in the subsequent.
She
did the first.
Yeah. But if I could just go on to other matters. Reading the application here before you because it was redirected to committee. That's why it is here. So that answers that particular question. Officers have to recommend on applications which, in accordance with the development plan for the area. Development plan is the core strategy. That is that together with the MPPF is where we must make recommendations on applications. Howell Hill is identified within your core strategy as an area for proportionate growth. I would refer to an appeal elsewhere on Howell Hill where an application was refused for housing development, where the inspector found that the area was suitable for proportionate growth. That appeal was allowed. Housing numbers. How the Walford parish have not reached its housing target for the area, which is, as you know, is a minimum. It's quoted in 6.31 of your report. There's a requirement for 91 houses between 2011 and 2031, 14 completions and 39 commitments as of April 21. Since then, has been a further 9 approved. Since April, so they are still 29 dwellings short of the target, the minimum target which is identified for Walford. Yes, we have a 6.19 year supply of affordable of housing. However, that figure drops away. The housing numbers drop off the end once they're completed. If you don't keep putting new permissions into the pot, you will vastly move down towards a figure which is below 5 years, and you'll all be aware of the issues when we haven't got a 5-year housing land supply, where limited or no consideration can be given to NDPs, which are then considered out of date if they haven't got any allocations and they're over 2 years old. So even when they've got allocations, if they're over 2 years old, those policies are considered out of date. Your core strategy in RA2, as I say, identifies the developments within and adjacent to settlements are supported, are in accordance with that policy. You've identified that Howell Hill has a neighbourhood, or the parish of the neighbourhood plan, which is at Regulation 16, is a consultation on Regulation 16, which will finish on the 31st of August. I understand there have already been representations regarding the settlement boundary. So an inspector or examiner will review will review the plan, will review the submissions made, and will consider whether to recommend amendments to the plan or not. So at the present time, we have to therefore give it limited weight. And so we give it limited weight in terms of the NDP. The fallback is that the core strategy, which is an adopted core strategy, holds the greater weight, and therefore you assess the application under RA2. The site is adjacent to, 3 sides of the site are adjacent to the settlement boundary. So the officers quite rightly therefore concurred that it's compliant with RA2 and therefore recommended approval for it. You have the comments from the highways officer raising no objections. Yes, I note the lanes are narrow. I used to cover that area myself as a planning officer many years ago, so I know the nature of the lanes. But that's no different to a lot of other areas within our county. And I would direct you to the last site visit you made for the last meeting, where you went to Longtown, where you would have travelled up very similar lanes to go there as well. So in that respect, the issues you are raising are clearly covered in the officer's report, clearly covered by the core strategy, and I would ask you to consider all those aspects in your consideration of the application. Thank you.
If I can just add to support Mr. Bishop's view on this, I've heard a lot of what's been said about the NDP and the weight that should be attached to it. And I understand from a local perspective that is the case. I'm also aware, having done a number of planning appeals, if you're simply at Reg 16 stage, which you are, or are about to get to that on 31st of August, at this point, an inspector will attach very little weight to that plan at this stage. That's simply a matter of fact, and that's why your planning officers are doing the right thing in not attaching significant weight to it, because if they were to do that, that would be disingenuous if this was appealed and then it was overturned. It would be simply nonsense. So one has to follow the line through. Now, one would hope that the process will go through and it will go towards adoption and the referendum, etc., will all be favourable. But at this stage, you cannot attach significant weight to it, and therefore you must treat that area with extreme caution. I've heard a lot about sustainability, and there are provisions in the Herefordshire plan on sustainability. That might be a safer route for you to look at. But I think to attach much weight to the NDP at this stage, I would counsel caution against doing that. Right, any other speakers? We have no proposal on the table. I must ask for members to make a proposal.
All right, I will propose that we refuse this application on the grounds of its unsustainability, that it is entirely reliant on private transport, and that, as the proxy ward member has said, we are in the midst of a climate emergency, and therefore the developments that are entirely reliant on private transport should not be encouraged. And I would be grateful if the planning officers now could perhaps help me on this one a little more.
Mr. Bishop.
Chairman, whilst my learned colleague here has mentioned sustainability and the members brought that up, I would caution against that. Howell Hill is identified within your core strategy as an area for appropriate growth, and that issue has been tested at appeal relatively recently.
That was, I understand, that was the nursery, was it not?
It was the nursery, sorry.
Well, that is, the nursery is actually on what passes for the main road in Howell Hill. This is not, this lane could be by no means even a main road. It's extremely narrow, one of the narrowest ones I've ever driven down. And remember, I've been on loads of site visits in this county. I mean, pedestrian safety is impossible. People have to leap into a hedge.
With respect, Councillor Andrews, what you refer to there are highway objections, not sustainability objections.
Well, I'll put
the
objections
sustainability
as well,
objections were clearly considered by the inspector in the appeal, which was dated the 2nd of September 2021.
I know, I read it.
And I would caution against that. If members are minded to refuse the application, what you should be looking at is, in your planning balance, you giving greater weight to the NDP settlement boundary on the Wolford policy 20, which identifies a settlement boundary for Howell Hill, and that is the area where you should be looking towards. As I say, officers have assessed that quite rightly that it's limited weight, but if you as members of the committee feel that that's the area where you should be looking to frame your refusal reason.
Thank you.
And Chairman, if I may, just to clarify my point, and I'm grateful that Mr. Bishop's pointed out those comments you were making, Councillor, were in relation to highways. I think you've got a difficulty there in terms of whether you've got support from highways on that. But when I was talking about sustainability, I was talking about the wider sustainability issues. I think Councillor Norman referred to some of those where you're looking at the ecology, you're looking at the facilities within Howell Hill and etc. Those may help you a bit more. I'm not advocating that you pursue.
No, they
that.
won't. They won't, because those have been dealt with previously. There's a deal as well.
Yeah.
The key issue is that the area is identified for proportionate growth within Howell Hill, and to some extent the NDP identifies that as well, because it's identified areas where development can take place within the settlement boundary.
Yeah,
but that is subject to review. And if we could be, if you do refuse the application, we could be in a scenario come an appeal. We don't offer any defence to the appeal, purely and simply because the inspector has included the site. Now that's an assumption, but that could well be the case. And we would then potentially have a claim for costs against the council.
Councillor Hardwick.
Right. With regards to the previous appeal on a different site, am I correct in believing that the 5-year land supply wasn't actually in place at the time?
Wasn't relevant.
Yeah. The decision was September 21, so we had a 5-year supply then.
We did.
Councillor Norman.
We finished.
I think so at the moment.
Thank you, Chair. Well, two things. One is I'm happy to second the proposal, but the other thing is really, and I appreciate we're looking for ways to get this right, if that's the route we're going. So thank you for your help. But I'm sure I have been in many planning meetings where we've been advised that what makes an application sustainable is the proximity of schools and pubs and this and that and all the services which are needed. I'm sure that's been part of what's been given to us as a way of convincing us that this is acceptable. Here we have the exact opposite, and I'm quite surprised if we can't build that into our, support for a refusal. The lack of all those services. Is there no way we can do that? Seems to me very, very relevant.
Can I assist? I think Mr. Bishop's going to find the actual paragraph. This has been looked at in the appeal, and Howell Hill has not been found wanting in those areas. The issue you've got is you are in a bit of a cleft stick corner, if I can double my analogies, because not only have you got this NDP that's still at a point at which limited weight can be attached to it, you've got a recent planning appeal. And I appreciate, and I'm very happy for every member to come back at me and say, you consider each application on its individual merits, and of course you do. But if you've got a planning appeal that's been determined recently in Howell Hill, and they have looked at these issues, that is a material consideration. And that does place you in considerable difficulty. Now, I apologise for that, if that helps, but that's the kind of application that comes before your committee.
Well, Thank you. I take that point, but I mean, the fact remains that those services are not there and they're not within any sort of reach other than by car, you know, and if that wasn't taken account of by the earlier inspector, then I would ask some questions about why it wasn't. But I'm listening to what you say, but I'm also, you know, pretty convinced that this is a reality we're facing.
Right.
Could I also ask, Chairman, a hedge, there is a very substantial and mature hedge. They've said that I think 1 metre has got to be removed. Having driven in and out of that, I would find that to be somewhat of an understatement. I think several metres will have to be removed to make that access in any way safe. Surely we have legislation that protects hedges.
If I may, Chairman, I think Councillor Andrews is quite correct in her assumption that more hedge would need to be removed. If you look at the actual drawings, the drawings in themselves actually show that more hedge would have to be or be required to be removed. Would I be right in assuming that this area of land would be classed as open countryside currently?
It's classified as open countryside adjacent, but it is adjacent on 3 boundaries to the settlement boundary. And I would, as regards the hedgerow, there is over 300 metres of new hedgerow to be planted as part of the scheme.
Yeah.
So,
new hedgerow isn't as good as existing hedgerow.
It takes 10 years or more to get
exactly.
Get established.
Jeff, could I ask a question? What was the previous site that we're referring to where there was an appeal? Was that a brownfield site?
Yes, it was the nursery.
it was a nursery site, but it covered all the points about sustainability and the fact that the main service centre is in Walford.
Right. Yes.
And that was identified, and that was identified that would have to be met by car, and that was acceptable.
Could I ask another question? Would it be relevant for the members of this committee to consider that if we did refuse it on the grounds that are being suggested, if it was appealed, the chances are that the neighbourhood plan would be at Reg 16 by the time it went to appeal? So
appeals are taking around about 6 months, 6 to 9 months, depending on the nature of the appeal, which is proposed, whether it's a written rep or hearing. Any change of policy running up to that appeal, the inspector would be advised on. So if the NDP had gone to examination or had progressed further than that, then the inspector would be informed of that. And there's 2 ways there. If the NDP is maintained in its present state and moves forward to adoption on that basis, the inspector would be informed of that, and obviously this site would therefore be outside the settlement boundary and will be contrary to the NDP, and the inspector would be advised accordingly, and I would hope an appeal will be dismissed. However, the landowners, I'm sure, will be making, if they haven't already, will make representations on the Reg 16 to request that land be included within the settlement boundary, which an examiner will consider. If that is the case, and that goes to that particular point, the inspector would be advised accordingly. In that scenario, then we'd have to consider, the council would have to consider its position in terms of defending that appeal.
Right. Do we have an actual proposal moved and seconded with a clear indication of the reasons for that?
Councillor Andrews has proposed, I've seconded. I appreciate we need some help in getting the wording straight, but I think I certainly still feel that this simply isn't a sustainable site in relation to the services and needs of the community who are living there and would be living there if we added to it.
Could I also comment? This is an ex-quarry, is it not? I'm just looking at 4.9. Has any can't think of the word. Any efforts been made to see what's underneath the grass there? Is it contaminated?
The environmental health officer has made his comments that they are aware of that, aware of the historic nature of the site. That's why they are content that they put a recommendation for a condition to be imposed in this particular instance. I think the members are looking, my advice to members, if they are looking for a reason for refusal, is to utilise the NDP Wolford 20, policy 20 as a reason to come forward with. That's what I would encourage you to do. If you're minded to refuse the application, and I think it should be framed around that, and you can add in the sustainability. We can add in sustainability to that in the MPPF. I would suggest you would. Well, that's all incorporated into the fact that it's outside the settlement boundary,
Yeah.
and that is that. But I caution, yes, that is an area that I need to hear from you that's what you want it refused on, and that you consider that the weight, a greater weight, should be attached to the NDP. And
I disagree.
that which is contrary to our advice, but that's a view to consider.
Councillor Rowe.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I think picking up on what both Councillor Andrews and Norman have said, I think it's outside the settlement boundary, even though it's adjacent to, therefore it's in open countryside. I think Councillor Mill was quite accurate with his with LD4 historic value. I don't know how RA2 sits with it, but for the local categories, Wolford 4 and Wolford 20. Otherwise, there's enough there. I would look to Mr. Bishop. And I've also picked that SS1. I think that might be a little bit.
I think if you major on those two, 4 and 20 would be your key ones.
And also added to that the strengthening of the outside of the settlement boundary. So therefore, I mean that.
RA2.
Yeah, I'm just trying to think that even though it is outside the settlement boundary, it's because it's adjacent on three sides, it can be determined and viewed on either side, but it's outside. And it's stated outside, so therefore if it's outside, it's in open countryside. So I think that
RA2 and LD1 landscaping landscape. Would be the ones.
LD4 as well for the historic. I would imagine it's hardly ever used, isn't it?
No, there's no that generally relates to listed buildings, etc., and ancient monuments, and etc. And it is not nothing of that nature.
We need to find a 17th century kiln underneath one of those.
I'm sure Councillor Milner's good for that.
The last one I had of those was an arsenal from the Napoleonic Wars, and that was underground, but we got away with that one. I think just because it's a quarry, I think that's true.
I thought that was a quarry.
But we don't know what it's been filled in with.
Well, that's it.
Well, environmental health touch.
Could we be advised through you, Chair? Could we be advised as whether we think that we've got?
And we got covered all the possible.
So I've got down here that you've Wolford 4 and 20 of the NPPF. NDP policies, core strategy policies, LD1 and RA2 will be the key policies, and the NPPF that we could incorporate into a reason for refusal, which we can put in front of the proposer and second chairman, if you're happy with that.
Thank you, Ken.
Thank you.
Okay, well, I think we a very difficult morning has got even more difficult as the day's got, the morning's gone on.
It's no afternoon, Ken.
Afternoon, sorry. Just, anyway, do you want any further comments?
Only from a planning perspective, Chairman, that the site is considered acceptable for development in accordance with the core strategy, in accordance with the development plan, taking into account the NDP, which has to be given limited weight at the present time, but I fully understand where members are coming from.
Thank you. To use the famous Mandy Rice Davis, he would say that, wouldn't he? Anyway, come to Councillor Wilding.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all members for a brilliant debate on this. There's a lot to be said, and we obviously accept that members of the planning committee and legal advice team are trying to help us through this, but their hands are slightly tied by government regulations, which are not enough up to date with the situation in terms of a climate and ecological emergency. So I accept your hands are tied there, but at some point, given that we've declared a climate and ecological emergency, someone has to stand up and be counted. And I think this is one of those occasions. But I just want to go through a few other things, points that came up. The housing target. Well, Walford, in the NDP, Walford have identified other areas for development which they consider to be better than this site. So it's not the case that it's this site or nothing, it's that other places should be pushed through and this site shouldn't. The housing supply, we accept that that could go down, but again, if Walford are able to identify other places which they consider better and are more sustainable, then they should be chosen before this one. Is it adjacent on 3 sides to the NDP boundary? No, it's only adjacent on 2 sides, because the 3rd side that you're talking about is actually a side onto another part of this field, which is yet to be developed and is outside the boundary. So I'll tell you what's going to happen. As soon as you get this one done, they'll go, well, this little bit is only is on 3 sides, so let's just fill that in and hooray, we've completely filled the whole field. When we talk about the previous appeal, it was for Howell Hill Nursery, which is a completely different site. The road that traffic comes out on is like a 2-lane. It's actually quite wide for a country lane. There's plenty of room. I imagine 3 cars could get side by side on it. So it's in no way anything like the lane that we're talking about. And so I believe it's a totally different situation. And that should, if it goes to appeal, that should be one of the council's arguments as to why the sites are different. Sustainability. It's all down once again to how we interpret sustainability. And how many times have I brought up the fact that sustainability, according to the United Nations and our own government and our own core strategy that we're all so happy to quote but take no notice of, says that sustainability is about managing the present so that it doesn't have an adverse effect on future generations. Well, you know, if you're going to vote that climate change and ecological emergency are actually happening in front of our eyes as we speak, then how can you pretend that this site is sustainable? It's just not possible. You've got to start saying people can't travel everywhere in cars. So what do we do about that? We don't give everyone a free electric car, because that would mean each one of them would have to drive 100,000 miles before it could even pay back its own carbon footprint. What we're suggesting is that our planning department and the government's planning policies start reflecting the actual situation we're living through, instead of continuously looking at it and going, oh, well, we can't do it because they say we can't. Well, I would suggest that the council should defend any planning appeal that's made. The council should defend this robustly and see it as a point where we can start changing the way planning is done in this country. Because I believe we're just completely walking into a total nightmare here. And it's about time we started doing something about it. Thanks.
Yeah, you're right to reply.
Thank you, Chairman. The department's been mentioned here. The department has to make recommendations on the development plan policies which are there before you. If we do not, we will have numerous appeals against us. We will lose those appeals. If the government want to come forward with immediate policy formation, they can do that. They haven't done that at the present time. So the officers within my team have to come forward to you with sound, reasoned recommendations. That's what they've done. That's what they will continue to do. They will make the change when the new local plan comes forward. That is the time a change will be made. Thank you.
Can I also remind you, it's all very well to talk of making a stand. Bearing in mind, make a stand. Making a stand when it's the taxpayers who are going to pay is one thing. If you're prepared to put up and underwrite the particular stand with your home and property, then good luck to you. I think that won't happen. Right, we've had a proposal and a seconder. Can I ask those in favour, please? 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. That is carried, I believe, unanimously.
No,
Sorry.
It was against.
Leaders abstain.
Against. Any abstention?
Any abstentions?
Yeah.
One abstention. Then that is carried. Thank you all for your attendance and your patience with a difficult meeting.